Hi, all. Thank you so much for coming out today post-lunch. Hopefully, you'll all still be awake. I'll try to keep it exciting. And thank you also, Eric and Sarah, for creating this really amazing space for us today. So my name is Rachel Kuo, and I'm currently at NYU's Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, working on a project around how digital media technologies mediate solidarities, coalitions, and alliances within and across racial justice movements. And rather than taking solidarity as something for granted, I'm really interested in the ways that people use it to negotiate political work and also shape activist worlds, and ways that imaginations around it as a vision and practice reveal a complex set of risks, instabilities, tensions, and challenges. And so in developing my research, I work really closely with different community partners with this goal of having the project contribute to field building work around movement technologies, so building alternative ecosystems with the logics, values, and needs of social movements in mind. And so a lot of my research comes from interviews with different organizers whom I've met and built relationships before starting this project, and from those conversations, really having that shape some of the questions that I'm pursuing, and also archival research that I've done at the Sophia Smith Archive, specifically around women of color feminist histories. And for me, looking at these different media histories has also been a really useful site towards insights in the design of future feminist computing systems and what kind of alternative infrastructures we can imagine for building communities of dissent. I also come to this work with a background in design and communication strategy, and that's really oriented me towards thinking about how design, especially technological design, can and should be a community process, and how different processes of internal and external communications practices also impact how people participate in movement campaigns and also build relationships with one another. Last spring, so this particular presentation that I'm riffing with you all today, came out of this conversation that I had with Charmin, who's a network coordinator over at Social Transformation Project and is also a community manager at Equality Labs, a South Asian tech org that works on ending caste apartheid and religious intolerance. And so when she was talking about her work on network coordination, she was talking about who is left out of this room, why are they not in this room, and what does it mean to not have this analysis? And that her work is around creating spaces for people to bring up the materiality and conditionality in which our oppressions have siloed us into not doing work together. And so in this observation, she's thinking about how and why organizations build broader points of unity and what it takes to bring people into relation with one another, into the same room. And she also talks about how bringing people together across difference requires a kind of work and also time and practice. In a lot of her workshops around undoing caste oppression, she also talks about what is the importance of creating these different intimate spaces for people to share experiences in ways that can't be surveyed, weaponized, and misused, and also that creating such spaces requires different acts of care beyond just getting people in a physical room together, right? So she talks about one of the ways that a relationship of accountability happens was because you saw us, we fed you, and you ate our food, right? And that produces a kind of communal intimacy and a commoning of that experience. So since that conversation, I've been thinking a lot about the conditions of possibility for producing deeper relationships around trust and accountability in our current technological landscape, and what is required for people to sustain engagement within experiences of conflict and discomfort, and also the process of building and maintaining networks as a practice and form of solidarity. So how do movements create and sustain connections, often across incommensurable and unequal difference? And how do people navigate strategies and barriers around the process of getting together, being together, and staying together? And how might these practices materialize desires for change? So in thinking about women of color feminist networking as a frame of analysis rather than an object of study or representational object, to really think about processes of systems transformation, how to think beyond individuals just being connected together, but also engage critically with how power manifests between relationships, how one's presence and relative positionality change the dynamics of a network, and how the lines between nodes come to be, how they change, and how they're maintained. And so this question that was in a self-evaluation paper by the Third World Women's Alliance, they asked, what have been the things politically, historically, and socially that have added to and made our conditions? How can we take those things and form ourselves so we can begin to destroy these conditions and build ourselves a new environment? And I feel like this question really guides around like how we form ourselves as one that's really present in current campaigns and movements as people are navigating how we build an ethos of trust, commitment, and care, and develop different models for decision-making and collaboration without replicating structures around domination and extraction. Right, and so organizing requires a lot of the facilitated mediation of relationships, including in transforming one's relationships with other people. One person that I spoke with described organizing as recognizing your own connections with others and seeing the ways that your own oppression is connected with theirs. In speaking with an organizer from a prison abolition campaign, they talked about the necessity of building movements around relationships where people can affirm and challenge one another. So they say everyone comes in with their own experiences and values. People come into movement spaces because of trauma and are still moving from a space of trauma. That looks like a lot of clashes where people aren't necessarily having political differences, but intense interpersonal differences. And that's a container for how people are together. Identities show up in ways that make it difficult for people to work together and can cause tensions if not resolved. And so, right, like despite shared political commitments, conflict in movement spaces can occur as people have different needs and experiences, right, and people are positioned to issues in different ways, and right, like, and people are often brought into these spaces because of personal encounters with systems of violence, but a lot of these encounters happen at different scales and registers. And so coming together into movement spaces, right, like doesn't immediately imply, right, like a seamless connection around unity, and that networks can also be these sites of conflict, breaks, ruptures, and disconnection. And also within these spaces, right, like the differential effects of power, right, like some people benefit from participating in a network more than others, and for other people, participation can have adverse effects. People also occupy really different modes of vulnerability and precarity, like in given markers of social difference that can continue to be exploited, right, like based on who's being extracted, like in terms of knowledge, information, and also labor. And so the reproduction of racial and gendered class divisions in movement spaces also contributes to when like different members split off into alternate formations. And so like with the Third World Women's Alliance, right, like that was when the Black Women's Alliance had originally split from SNCC in 1968. And so in these ruptures, these new formations are these various attempts to materialize future visions and recreate collective forms of living. And so today I'll be sharing some materials from the Third World Women's Alliance archives as a way to historicize how we conceptualize networks and to think about how relationships are envisioned and enacted through the work of networking, and juxtaposing some of these materials along different reflections from organizers, so like little temporal jumps. And then so rather than like look at networks as these like moments of seemingly spontaneous eruption, really thinking about what the archives can tell us about moments of care and conflict as part of the process of movement building, and how the network's mutable form, how we can denaturalize that and really think about how structural shifts are part of a more laborious process. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with the Third World Women's Alliance, it was founded by Fran Beal, and again, originated out of SNCC in 1968. And she had originally first created the Black Women's Liberation Committee, and then as like more members who were less affiliated with SNCC joined, they changed their name to the Black Women's Alliance. And then later, right, like there was this question as like Puerto Rican women who had really wanted to build bonds of solidarity and the reproductive justice movement came, like they began to ask, right, like, well, what, right, like are these kinds of different points of unity and these constraining connections that connect together these different communities? And then as the organization began to identify capitalism and imperialism as part of their political line, they expanded to include Puerto Rican women and also Asian, Chicana, Native American women within this formation, and became the Third World Women's Alliance. And in each of these iterations, right, like they constantly negotiated these contradictory layers around their political focus, group composition, and membership standards. And as they took on different forms over the years, they also like struggled with this ongoing tension to locate a logic of compatibility that connected their membership together. So a lot of the documents I looked at were on these like updated versions as they kept working and working at it, their principles and practices, and in these different iterations of their internal materials, like ended up tracking this particular conversations that they had around membership composition. So like on the surface, this debate was like, seemed to be something around, right, like who should be included in a multiracial alliance, right? Like, what is the group's racial composition gonna be? But more deeply, like, the question at stake reveals this larger struggle of developing solidarities while confronting hierarchical relationships within a broader collective. And so I focus on their process of assembling, undoing, and reassembling their membership in order to produce this notion of collectivity, and also to kind of think about how this process shows us something about the production of networks and networking as an ongoing practice and the making of relationships within a selection of people. And so also, rather than romanticize their work as this ideal of solidarity, really thinking about it as this kind of tenuous pursuit. And so when the group was starting to increase their membership, they released this principles document to articulate an organizational philosophy, and they like really locate it as this kind of starting point, and as an aspiration and of this like dynamic living record. And like in this document, one of the things that they wrote in their work method was that we must remember that our most important resource is people. We develop our strengths and move forward together. And so a lot of these ongoing edits and updates within these principles reveal the story around what people are imagined to be and imagined to do collectively, as well as these contentions underlying the production of unity, including various missteps and failures in attempts to facilitate unity across difference. And really how they're thinking about the value of a network isn't always scale and mass numbers, but like the selection of people within. And so really thinking about the stakes of this work, right? Like the decision around who's included is also this matter of security and community safety. So they were one of the organizations that was surveyed by the FBI's like counterintelligence program in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of the records from their archives include these FBI reports and memos, and like including like, right, like people's phone numbers, addresses, and also a lot of like reprints of their print media, which was like their newsletter called Triple Jeopardy. So basically like, the FBI just like reprinted line by line, like all of these things that was like in their newsletter. And so because of this, their organization, it had established the security subcommittee to create protocols for participation in information sharing. And so they wrote, "We're always in the presence of an enemy." They noted while their stage of struggle was not one that required like all organizing to be covert for the purposes of survival, that their organizing was at a stage of taped phone conversations and agent infiltration. And so they wrote, "We are at a stage where you can be incriminated for wanting to be free." And so the security document, they compiled, like, or the committee compiled this document to address petty bougie traits as their security threats, like, right? And so they named egotism, liberalism, subjectivity, and individualism to suggest that combating these traits would be part of their security measures, and how that egoism marks the desire to make one's self-importance and the status of an organization, and the desire to disclose information about the structure for the purposes of bragging. And so in many ways, their protocol is about this process of de-individuation, right? Like to become non-identifiable. And their critique of ego as a security threat also foreshadows these particular difficulties in our current digital organizing landscape, right? Like where platforms are designed to cater towards ego and cultivate like a certain sense of like self-efficacy that seems to happen. And they also end up like writing in this document, right? Like the things that you do or say are subject to connection, which means that you can be tied up with actions performed by others who are political, and like, right, really pointing to this logic of proxies that's gonna, like that also happens like today, right? Like these data correlations that draw conclusions based on these captured traces of actions to reinforce, yes, like, okay. Thank you for that. I know I tend to speed up once I see the time signal. That draw conclusions based on these like traces of actions to reinforce a target profile. Oops, sorry. And so, like notably, right, like so TWWA, they're a socialist organization, and so really what's important here, both in the security protocol and in a lot of the principles, is that they're striving to undo these logics of liberalism, right, like which is very much embedded in the ways that the internet was like created, and these logics that are kind of embedded within that, right, like that tends to overemphasize independent autonomy. And so they're constantly challenging this construction and valuation of individualism, right, like challenging what Saidiya Hartman calls the lures of liberalism, where there's an overvaluation and personalization and individuality that fabricates, right, like a universality that also obscures the ways that interdependent relations of power play out. And so they really are attempting to generate this we through a rejection of individualism, both the commoning of the self and trying to produce this we as a common subject as both their work method and security measure. And so this isn't to say, right, like that individuals themselves like aren't important and they don't matter, but to really think about the importance of each individual within the network, their position, and how their relationships with one another are essential to facilitating a kind of interdependence around safety, security, and trust. And so throughout the time, right, like and over the course of the 70s, they really struggled with this crisis of a fragmented political identity as they tried to create this. And they always like were trying to reiterate these documents around like who are our people, like who is the common enemy, and like what is the process to work together. And like eventually, right, like in the mid 70s, there was this other document that was like, we're spending so much time on like what we're like, and trying to define ourselves, that like what is the actual way that we're operationalizing this in a kind of function, right? Like that it's like a lot of labor to produce these documents and to have a long-term vision, but like what is like the actual function? And so they ended up shifting like and writing this kind of paper that was called like the kind of around like the consolidation of their campaign. And so originally they wanted to build a mass, like broad, like scale organization, and then they shifted into a priority around consolidating themselves. And so they wrote, our priority for now should not be third world women willing to work within TWWA, nor those who merely want to associate themselves in a nebulous way. And so they were really thinking critically about how do we prioritize deeper connections and measuring depth through the frequency of participation and trust, right? Like a member to follow through on tasks or something like that. And they were also really thinking about like how do we minimize individualism while also cultivating individuals to have a deeper relationship with the organization. And so kind of connecting that to today's organizing landscape, a lot of networking technologies, while they emphasize speed and scale as their primary design value, at times like while those may be necessary, they aren't always the most conducive for long-term movement work. And so speaking with someone who was one of the organizers in the campaign against jails expansion in New York City, which some of you may be very familiar with, they talked about the importance of building relationships with people more deliberately. And so they say, a lot of people have gotten involved. I've also been thinking about how a few people can do a lot. Balancing the depth, number, and breadth of relationships requires a certain amount of time. And all people have to do is make friends with each other, and that's organizing, and that takes a while. And so they talked a lot about the ways that digital platforms designed for speed and distraction isn't necessarily conducive towards exacting long-term change. Right, and so like, and if you think about this in the context of a campaign that is urgent and requires rapid response, like what that longer term like process of like waiting and thinking and building more deliberately, like what that also does in terms like of a longer term like future around liberation and what it means to connect people together. And a lot of underlying these like observations, right, and the kind of questions that begin to prop up are also what are the reciprocal and mutual responsibilities of people who enter into forms of connectivity, right? Like that it's not just enough to enter, but what is the responsibility once you're like participating within a space? And so this language of around collective work and devotion, like if we think back towards like the Third World Women's Alliance, like they also produced a lot of like these documents around work. And so they wrote things like, we have to fuse our energies into one solid unit. We have to pull all of the pieces together. We must never fall into the rut of smug complacency. And so a lot of these iterations and these questions around work are really reminiscent of Audre Lorde's essay, Learning from the 60s, where she constantly refers to work, right? Like actively working for change, working for the future, and this unromantic and tedious work necessary to form meaningful coalitions. And also for the Third World Women's Alliance, right? Like they write that political liberation would only be achieved through the hard work of all of us together. And so often movements tend to be remembered by their speeches, their rallies, the direct actions, rather than a lot of the efforts leading up to them that are always ongoing, right? Like the writing of leaflets, like the person who takes notes at a meeting and circulates them, like the maintaining of contact lists, organizing resources, like all of this like schedule coordinating that needs to happen. And so a lot of the work that like these organizations that are being gestures towards are also the undervalued and less visible tasks and roles within social movements, right? Like administrative and reproductive labor and what it takes to really cultivate and nurture network bonds. And so similarly, in other like interviews, I was talking to someone who works around housing displacement in Chinatown, and they again like talk about what it means to scale down and focus. And they say, the local is where you can connect to and have a sense of control. The Amazon victory, the tenant laws that passed. That's hard fought, multi-year organizing. So my community right now is locally planted, and how we strengthen our real life face-to-face relationships. Sometimes we talk about community in general terms, but at the end of the day, it's relationships that sustain us. It's finding like minds that isn't just people who go from protest to protest and post. Social change work is always about the local and always about relationships and trust. And so this person also has a collective, and they talked a lot about how they're pausing and reevaluating and consolidating their relationship network to strengthen themselves as a group, and also how they're thinking more critically about their external coalitions and alliance, and thinks about it in terms of slowing down as a way to cultivate deeper relationships. And similarly, Charmin had said over and over again, right, you have to expect trust, and that can only come when you see someone showing up for you again and again and again, whether that's at a rally, at a meeting, and taking risks, right? And so these acts of consolidation within networks, rather than just building to scale, is also about these acts of repetition and the deepening of bonds that people are really think about of what it means to really do work together and sustain that together, and think about, right, again, how people's different positionalities within the network are allowing them to participate or not, right? Depending on people's different capacities at different moments in time, and to balance that. So closer, near the end of the 70s, right? So the Third World Women's Alliance was still really struggling with their goal of building a mass movement, and they were also at the end, really replicating hierarchical divisions, right? They kept describing themselves oh, we're the left and we're organizing the masses, and replicating these logics of who needs to be developed and organized. And so really also contending with that, and the kind of ways that also third world as a formation, really wasn't something that was particularly useful again at that time, right? And so that as an organizing rubric in the late 60s was no longer something that was helping them build unity by the late 70s. And so core leaders assessed a lot of the decline in their membership, and also the ways that they were able to kind of contribute to other progressive movements at the time was due to these separatist ways of individual racial and national groups that began to also pop up a lot more in the 80s. And so they kind of go back to thinking about individualism as the strong disincentive towards building unity, right? So the piece of the pie mentality they wrote, or the my group above all others and me above my group. And so they were really thinking about, again, what does it take to build unity? And this question of racial composition was raised again, and this time was around they were okay, we're going to shift into developing class consciousness and really think about redefining membership and identifying capitalism as the kind of common enemy. And so they ended up reshaping their organization and deciding, right, we are going to reshape our racial composition to also include white women and develop that. And with that, right, in this change in racial composition, they changed their formation, and they were no longer the Third World Women's Alliance, and became the Alliance Against Women's Oppression. And so really thinking about this proliferation of new collectivities and structures in response to crisis movements, there's also this trap of newness, right? Where starting over becomes the initial solution. And sometimes when new formations are necessary, they're also intertwined and overlaid on top of previous formations and iterations, and hold within them, right, the existing problems and fractures. And so in these later documents, as they were forming the AAWO, they talked about a lot how the Third World Women's Alliance struggled with homophobia in their organization, that was an ongoing issue that they had. And so they were really okay, we're going to build a multiracial revolutionary socialist women's organization to include lesbian and straight women, and they kept putting that in all of their documents. And so there's also around this time, right, if we think about the context of the 80s and liberal, and the ways that multiculturalism is becoming a kind of dominant ideology, there's this impulse also around defining and including people based on identity categories that's simultaneously thinking about being inclusive, yet it's also detrimental in terms of as they were constituting a core base, right? And so they kept putting queer women of color, and pulling them into building and expanding the organization, and then a lot of those needs began to fall to the wayside, and being pulled in all of these different directions were also accelerating feelings of burnout, which was in a lot of their letters and memos, and feeling right that they were building this organization that at the end of the day still wasn't for them. And so at the time of then the late 80s, this organization became defunct, and then became back to being a women of color organization called the Women of Color Resource Center that was founded by Linda Burnham. And so if we think about this history, right, of how these organizations wane and they're kind of built out of the ashes of previous organizations, it really tells this history of networking that follows a long and varied network life that spans across different formations and levels, requiring constant recalibrations given internal and external feedback, and also showcases the cyclical and recursive nature of networks. And so their emphasis on membership that shows that networks rely on the collective strength of people and who is included among them really matters. And further inclusion may not always enable unity, but can sometimes make these practices of being together more difficult. And so with the aim of sustaining longer-term movement building, they demonstrated networking as this ongoing process and thinking really critically around the implementation of partnerships, how to develop mechanisms to evaluate questions of trust, commitment, and resource sharing given relationships with other individuals and organizations. And so I kind of wanted to leave you all with this quote that someone else had said, right, about this kind of process of accountability. And so, and this is from someone who's a cultural organizer in New York City, and they say, if you have a collective vow to come back to community no matter what, to come back over again, that makes possible a certain kind of relationship and conversation. I wonder what community would look like if it were formed taking on something impossible like a vow. For a lot of people, the revolution was a vow that they're still moving towards and still is for some people. And I think once we have that kind of agreement, it makes it possible to engage people's differences and full acceptance of each other. And so really thinking about, right, what it takes for people to continue to vouch for, trust, and take care of one another, while acknowledging, right, that sometimes harmful relationships, we need to let them go, but also, right, how do we take seriously the kind of tenuous political commitments that people can hold with one another, and how do we sustain movements, right, based on principles that center people and relationships as a core and necessary resource. So I'll leave you with that, and then this is just a little bit of my reading list, because I know people like resources, so I'll leave that up for the Q&A.
Yeah, so we have time for some questions if anyone has one. Yep. Oh, actually, I had one question. Duncan? Duncan? Oh, perfect. That's what I was going to ask for.
Hi. Sorry for shouting out. I just was trying to take notes, and my hand was going so fast. I was like, please, talk slower. My name's Camille. I'm from the Collective for Liberation, Ecology, and Technology. We're a radical feminist tech collective in Brooklyn. And we've been working with a larger formation of women from numerous different sorts of tendencies and organizations to think through some of these questions and dialogue over history. So I'm pretty enthusiastic. One of the things in the formation of our collective that was really central was embracing impermanence and checking with ourselves about when the organization was not going to be necessary anymore. In your reading and findings, do you find where people did that? I know there is a long-term commitment to revolution, liberation, but is there an embrace of impermanence of the particular formation? Because I think that's pretty crucial, because I think a lot of times people are like, this group has to keep existing forever, and a lot of the tensions come out of that. And then secondly, I'm also interested in the tension as a more anarchist-leaning person. I don't think socialism has inherent an ongoing effort to root out hierarchy. There's more of a fight against capital. So I'm interested also in whether you encountered any sort of more anarchist-leaning women of color in your studies.
Thank you. Yes, so thank you so much for that question. And I think this question that you have of embracing impermanence is something, right, that really shows up in the archives, right? Because a lot of these organizations are ones that no longer exist. But what's really interesting, right, is that a lot of the people and their relationships are not impermanent, right? So the organization and collective as a whole, that might disappear in a kind of in its iterative form, but people who are really close might go on, right? Two people go out and start something different. And a lot of of the Third World Women's like Alliance, their archives was out of like Miriam Ching-Yun Louie's papers that she donated, and like in those folders, right, like there's like all of these organizations that like in her life that she's like part of, and she like continues to kind of do movement work today. And so there's like these ways that a lot of these relationships kind of continue in different forms and they shift, but the organizations themselves are not. And I think maybe to think about your question around like anarchist formations, right, like the question of sustaining also then becomes this question, right, of like is a collective or an organization willing to become like institutionalized in a particular way, and the politics that come with sustaining, right, like in terms of like funding, in terms of then like what are the measures and protocols for sustaining and things like that. So I think there's a lot of give or take, like when organizations try to make a move towards a kind of permanence, that then there's like a kind of different like loss around like what are like the different ways that they can experiment with like the different relationships that they hold with one another.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Rachel.